Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. It's always, I think there's always better turnout when you provide breakfast, right? So good learning. I'm excited for today's panel around true diversity. It's a topic that is of great interest to me. I actually spent some time when I worked at Procter & Gamble, and we used a pretty intensive survey to look at culture and diversity. There were 13 dimensions of those, none of which were skin color, country of origin. It was very much to look at the individual and how that person came to be. And so it was kind of the first time I really dove into that and saw there might be a better way forward. Unfortunately, where things are today, there's some real challenges in how do we address the diversity issue. And so I'm excited to have with me Patrice and Mike. Just by way of a quick introduction for these two. Patrice is the director for the Center of Economic Opportunity at the Independent Women's Forum. She is a senior adjunct fellow for the Philanthropy Roundtable and a Tony Blankley Fellow at the Steamboat Institute. Mike is a prolific writer. I recently read one of his books on Black Lives Matter movement, but he is a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation and does write extensively on critical race theory, and so has a tremendous understanding and background of how we got to where we are today, which I think can help us inform where we want to go moving forward. So before we jump in, I gave a little bit of, in terms of kind of why this is an important topic for me and kind of my experience, but before we talk a little bit about how we got here with diversity, equity, inclusion, Patrice and Mike, maybe just take a minute and why is this an issue area or an area that you've kind of dedicated your time and have a real passion to find a better way forward for us generally, but also for the freedom movement? So Patrice, maybe for you first.
Sure, thank you, Lyall. I'm an interesting person. I'm Black, female, Republican, conservative, immigrant. And I check a lot of boxes, but I surprise a lot of people when I open my mouth and share some of the viewpoints that I do. And I think that's wrong. I like to challenge people to break free from the idea of stereotyping, especially when it comes to viewpoint diversity. You know, I'm more than my skin color, I'm more than my gender, I'm more than, where I came from. I'm more than all of that. And frankly, my lived experiences, my pedigree, the things that my background, that I bring much more to the table than just gender and race. And unfortunately, we're at a time right now where that is all that seems to matter. That is all that seems to be what propels someone like me forward. And to me, it does a disservice. It opens the door to criticism of tokenism and frankly, resentment from other people who say, well, why is she there and not me? When very often, when you're skilled, when you have experience, when you have backgrounds that support whatever role you're taking on, that is what makes you the right person for the job. I work as an adjunct fellow for the Philanthropy Roundtable, talking about true diversity and writing about true diversity because I think we need to embrace a broader understanding of what true diversity should look like. It should not be a shortcut of limiting diversity just to race and gender. We've got to think more broadly. And so I'm excited about this campaign. It's not just talking about, we need true diversity. It is how do we, with organizations, foundations, charities, as well as the broader movement, move our society towards having a broader understanding of what diversity should be through messaging, through research, through the tools to be able to have those conversations.
Great, thank you. Mike?
So a very similar answer to what Patrice gave. But first, I want to thank all of you for being here on the Atlas Network and the wonderful work of the Philanthropy Roundtable. It's a thrill for me to be here with Patrice. I listen to Patrice every Friday because she's on a radio station in DC when I commute in the morning. Look, it's very similar. I guess you want the personal element, and I'll give a little bit of that, but that is limited. Obviously, I don't want to see my good last name hijacked in the culture war on behalf of people who want to divide the country. I think that is, I don't like that at all. I remember distinctly in the early 70s in our neighborhood in Queens, not too far from here, when my uncle came home and said, they're gonna start calling us Hispanics now. And I was like, what? Where's that from? Is that because Grandpa was born in Spain? And I said, no, it's the new name that the bureaucracy is gonna have for us. And that was that was new to us. It was imposed by the activists on the bureaucracy. But I think beyond that, because after all, I have been here for half a century. I'm an American. I'm passionate about the Constitution and the Declaration. I'm passionate about this country. To make decisions based on race is illegal. It's violative of the Constitution, and it's immoral. And if you know anything about the history of this country, we have made decisions based on race. We did have systemic racism. We did have decisions made on race. If you owned a lunch counter in Alabama under Jim Crow and you wanted to serve a black family, you couldn't do it. The law didn't allow you to. So that didn't work. We decided in the 60s to stop doing this. We can go back later to the history of the 60s where this goes back to. But it really is this idea that enough is enough. We really don't want to we don't want to divide people based on race. I'm very passionate about true diversity because that you don't get, people say, well, there's a benefit to having a diversity of views in a room. And I believe that there is. You're not going to get that if you think that people are spokespeople for their race or their national origin. I certainly don't think like every Cuban American. I'm not a spokesperson for Cuban Americans. I'm a spokesperson for myself. I have my own views that have everything to do with my own views. I lived also 10 years in Asia, many years in Europe. All of that goes into making who I am. I'm not an ethnic category.
Yeah, thank you. Mike, maybe we'll come back to you and start here with going back a little bit. So how did we get to where we are with this diversity, equity, and inclusion? I mean, a lot of times the names change, and DEI was something else 15 years ago, and it was something else 15 years before that. And so I know it's something that you've got a deep and rich understanding, but if you could take just a few minutes and just kind of run us, I know history in 2 minutes or 3 minutes is tough, but how did we end up where we are today and kind of this evolution in terms of some of the foundations you shared with me, kind of going even back maybe a little bit to the 30s, and just walk us to today.
Right, so I would say that it's good intentions, bad intentions, and guilt in equal parts. First, you have good intentions. We have disparities. We have racial disparities in every indicator. And we'll go later into how you arrive at those, because it really depends on how you slice the group, right? But if you just look at African Americans, white Americans, Hispanic Americans, if you look at these groups, and we shouldn't, but if you look at these groups, then you do have disparities. And people are offended by that. And of course, it is offensive. And there's also a history of ill treatment of African Americans, a long history, not just slavery, but Jim Crow, Plessy versus Ferguson. But then you have the good intentions, but you have the bad intentions, people who want to use race as a cleavage, as something to transform the country. And they do this on purpose, and they say they do it on purpose, and we need to look into why they do it. For example, if you look at somebody like Eric Mann, very well-known communist, who gave a very telling interview in 2015 to a Venezuelan radio station, he said, and he's not alone, he said, well, whether we use race or sex or climate, this is just a little division of labor that we have in order to destroy America. And then and they feed on guilt. They feed on the guilt, and again, they say that. You know, Nicole Hannah-Jones of the 1619 Project, Alicia Garza, they all say, yeah, this guilt. And Patrice Colors, when they asked her, how did you raise $100 million in 2020? She said that was a heck of a lot of white guilt money going on. And I think that it's this use of that. Very quickly, by the 30s, the foundations were funding. By the way, foundations have funded trends for a very long time. If you go back to Kellogg and Carnegie, you find that they were funding research on eugenics in the 1930s. And then today we say, well, that's disgusting. So I would say be very careful about funding the trends of the moment. Then Kennedy issues his first executive action, I think it was 90120, in 1962, which has the words affirmative action, but it means the opposite of what we understand as affirmative action today. It said that government contractors had to take affirmative action to make sure that they were not hiring according to race, or national origin. And within a few years, that gets turned around very quickly. You have people like George Bundy, who had been a dean at Harvard. They became national security advisor to Kennedy. And then in 1966, he's made the head of the Ford Foundation. He's racked with guilt about Vietnam. He's racked with guilt about everything. And that very, very white, Northeastern white establishment panics when they see what is taking place in the cities with the riots in 67, 68. And he said, I think he called it temporary separation. There was a need to have temporary decisions based on race. When the Bakke decision comes in 1978, he writes a very articulate piece in The Atlantic, which is pilfered by Harry Blackman in his opinion in the Bakke case, saying in order to get away from making decisions based on race, we must first take account of race. And this is supposed to be temporary. That was 40 years ago.
Yeah.
Just to pick up on that.
Patrice, go ahead.
So now where we're at, we've got Ibrahim Kandi, who says, I think his quote is, where I see racial disparities, I see racism. And this idea that to rectify the racial disparities, you need to take an equitable approach, an anti-racist approach, which means using current discrimination to rectify past discrimination. Regardless of whether either discrimination is wrong, the current movement right now is to say, well, you've got to be an anti-racist. And in one of my other hats, I've taken we see this bears out in the private sector with training courses on anti-racism and how to be a good anti-racist in the workplace. And I've taken these courses, and they're just as ridiculous as the name sounds, but that's where we're at. And I think, what's interesting with philanthropy in the charitable sector, picking up on something you just said about foundations funding, is that we are ground zero now for a lot of this anti-racism movement. Number one, foundations and charitable organizations, but foundations and private donors sit on a significant amount of wealth that they are just giving away to support varied causes, everything from soup kitchens and workforce development programs to environmentalism, and even public policy organizations such as the ones in this room. And so what the demands being made is, if you want to prove you're an anti-racist, if you want to prove that you can help fix society and move it forward, then you've got to give money to certain causes, social justice, whatever the type of organization it is, with no accountability, no questions for how the money is used and where it's going. Number two, your boards and your staff and leadership need to look a certain way. Quotas, mandates. These are kind of the demands that we're seeing in the philanthropic sector. Regardless of mission, which is critical, mission organizations are brought together for a mission and a purpose, not just to necessarily use a specific way forward to do so. And second, with no regard for outcomes. The problem with equity, the problem with anti-racism is that it's about getting everyone to the same outcome rather than giving everyone the same opportunity and allowing them to end where they end up. You're never gonna, can I just say something very controversial?
Sure.
You're probably never gonna get rid of a lot of racial disparities. They exist, and there are different reasons why, and Thomas Sowell talks greatly about that. But we can move the needle forward and see lifts in poverty, lift groups of people out of poverty, not by just throwing a bunch of cash at a particular organization, but by developing the human capital. That is what is lasting, that is what empowers individuals, and that is what is missing from a lot of these anti-racism DEI movements right now.
Let me just say very briefly, I'm usually the one who says something controversial. I do think we can get rid of disparities. Scandinavia 100 years ago had a great deal of corruption, and then they actually changed the culture, and nobody associates Scandinavia today with corruption. Kendi, the phrase from Kendi, from How to Be an Anti-Racist, which I think many of you have read, and that is a troubling idea, is that in order to remedy past discrimination, we need present discrimination. No, we can't take a time machine. There's nothing we can do about the past. There's no time machine. to say that to commit a wrong today, present discrimination is an injustice. We're committing an injustice against somebody who had nothing to do with the horrors of centuries or decades ago. So committing an injustice today will definitely not fix something that we will never be able to fix because we cannot fix the past.
Okay, now as we start to look at this, I mean, clearly there's Mike, I know you'll get to this, there's an affirmative action case, right? So now as we think about, we can't go back, so how do we go forward? We kind of talked a little bit about some of the issues that, the past, the issues that we currently face, so what's the way forward? So Patrice, maybe I'll start with you, and then Mike, I'd be interested in your thoughts on the current case and you know, how do we look at affirmative action or what potentially it was trying to accomplish. So I know Philanthropy Roundtable, again, you're very concerned about the funders, which I'm sure everybody in this room is worried about funders too. I hear it all the time. How do we fundraise better? So given the seat that you're in and what Philanthropy Roundtable is doing, I just think it would be helpful for folks in the room to understand what you're trying to accomplish, and then maybe even a little bit, you know, what should they be on the lookout for, and how can they engage in this True Diversity initiative? So
Absolutely.
we'll start there.
Sure. So True Diversity is a positive, uplifting campaign that says, number one, we should not be reflexively anti-diversity, but we need to broaden and force society to broaden its definition of what diversity should be. Diversity has become a shorthand for race and gender, and maybe even LGBTQ now. But that, as I said, that's very limited, that's very myopic, very, very narrow in scope, and doesn't help organizations achieve their mission any better. It doesn't, frankly, the DEI initiatives that are based on race and gender have not moved the needle forward in lifting groups of people locked in generational poverty, have not moved them forward. Their outcomes have been, at best, and Mike can talk about it because we were talking about it earlier, it helps a few people, but it doesn't help the people who I grew up in when we moved to this country in Boston, in a poor neighborhood, where kids, and I went to school with kids who had been on welfare and their families for generations. It has not helped those kids. That's what we need to figure out how to do. And so True Diversity says, well, number one, the most basic fundamental person, or when we think about diversity, should be the individual. It's not a class. It's not your participation in a particular group. It is not whether you're black or female or white or whatever the checked box is. It is you as an individual. Number two, it's about getting to holding the conversations that are going to be difficult. Having in organizations, having conversations, that are going to be tough, but trying to find a way to find the individuals, find the causes that are most important and that are actually doing the great work. Keeping mission center in what you're doing, not just saying, well, we need to change the way we're doing, we need to change who we're supporting, who we're helping, how we're funding, just because an activist says you need to do so, or just because even some of your grantees are demanding certain changes internally. We want to cultivate this idea of empowerment. Empowerment not from a government mandate, empowerment not from a certain quota or mandate, but empowerment by developing that human capital in the individual, as I was talking about before. It is very much bringing it back to that person and what they can bring to the table and how we can build them. Now, how do we do that? Well, you know, there are a lot of great organizations that are on the ground in communities across the country every single day, helping to build that human capital in individuals who've never seen someone get up and a father get up and go to work every day and come home and take care of his wife and take care of his family, who've never seen that you can actually aspire to more than just playing basketball or being a singer. And that's the kind of neighborhood I grew up in. Those were the only two occupations for black kids. No, there are many more who don't understand that there are certain social skills, certain social types of socialization that are needed just to be able to break into the marketplace and develop and sell your skill set to the highest bidder. But there are things that there are organizations, and you know, I love to talk about the Woodson Center, Bob Woodson. Amazing, he has a network of, I think it's probably thousands of organizations that are doing this every day. What you hear from one side is, well, the government is the only solution because the government is the problem. As Mike said, yeah, there has been systemic racism in the past in the laws, but what exists today is not really that. There may be cultural differences, I don't know. But what I think we're missing today is a focus on building the individual and exposing people, whether you're in Appalachia or you're in Roxbury, Massachusetts, to the skills, to the opportunities, and to the potential that's there for them. And so campaigns like True Diversity is helping us do that.
Mike, the Supreme Court case is kind of prime right now. And I know as we were talking earlier, I mean, the concern is that we've said no to a lot of things, right? So affirmative action's wrong, so what's right? What's the right way forward? So I appreciated your commentary that I read the other day, but any thoughts there in terms of where the court will land, and what's maybe a positive agenda in addition to what Patrice has mentioned here as groups in this room to pursue to address this issue in a meaningful way?
So the Harvard and North Carolina case, and I first of all, if you follow the Supreme Court during your lives, you know that we can't predict it. There were a lot of people who thought it was going to be a red wave last week that didn't materialize. So we really don't know. I think, and maybe this is my hope, getting a hold of my analytical thinking, but I do think that the Supreme Court will this time decide that that racial preferences, really we should not say affirmative action, the racial preferences is a violation of our ideals. And the reason for that is racial. Bakke, the plaintiff in the 78 case, Grutter in the 2003 case, and Abigail Fisher in Fisher 2 and Fisher 1 and Fisher 2, about 6 or 7 years ago, they were all white. This is not the case with the Harvard, North Carolina case. As students of fair admissions, they're Asian Americans, mostly Chinese Americans. Now, if you look at the Chinese American population, it is over 90% first generation and second generation. That is the immigrant and his children. Because sure, there are Chinese Americans who have been here for generations, but really that is a very small percentage. The reason I say this is because these are people who have arrived in this country, not with language skills, having zero connections, and have really worked. If you look at the money that a blue-collar worker, a Chinese-American blue-collar worker devotes to tutoring his children, it's a very large part of his income, and they have achieved, they have demonstrated that they have given the lie to white supremacy. They have been able to achieve by adhering to norms, right? They have a teeny yincy-wincy divorce rate. They don't really, it's the same thing with the out-of-wedlock rate, and they put a huge emphasis on education. Oh my God, they succeed. What they're claiming, and I think they have a very good case, is that Harvard today is doing exactly the same thing that Harvard did in the 1920s to Jewish Americans. We go back to the past and the wrongs that were. So the president of Harvard realized that he could not have an anti-Jewish quota at Harvard. So what they did was they sought characteristics, traits that were associated with Gentiles, and gave that a plus. Chinese Americans are very good in GPA, very good in SATs, very good on extracurricular activities, but they get dinged on personality traits. All of a sudden, oh my God, Chinese Americans do not have any leadership qualities. So that is obviously offensive, and I believe for that reason that they will win. Now, let's say that I'm right, and the Supreme Court will finally, let's not forget, Senator O'Connor in the Grutter case in 2003 said, look, it's been 25 years since Bakke. Let's hope that this will not last another 25 years. Well, guess what? That 25 years comes up in 2028. We're very close to that, and we still have this. A real wrong. Racial preferences are a real wrong, and everybody suffers. She suffers, I suffer, and obviously the Chinese Americans and the whites were kept out suffer. I think what will happen is once we get beyond this very clear, all affirmative action does is papers over the problem. It cuts corners. It says, we're not going to address the causes. We're going to decree by fiat that a certain percentage of a classroom has to be of X category. Now that we remove this, we say, no, that's illegal. You can no longer do this if you take government money, and that's every school in the country. Then we're going to start looking at what causes the disparities. Because we don't want the disparities, right? So is it the bad schools? Probably yes. Is it family formation? Yes, very much yes. And we need to, so what do we do? Are we going to have an all-of-society approach to family formation? In 1965, when the Surgeon General went on TV and showed a cigarette and said, "This kills you," 70% of American males smoke. Today, it's under 19%. We went out of our way to say, if you smoke a cigarette, you're just cutting your life. We should have a same approach to family formation because it is a killer, it's a colorblind killer of all communities.
Yeah, maybe that gets, in terms of solutions, maybe a next step on that would be how do we message this, right? I think those who push the DEI, maybe we should say it DIE, that's a good way for societies to die. But the DEI, I mean, it's very catchy messaging. It does play on this kind of white guilt that, you know, they're not covert about, you know, that they're playing on that. So as we think, you know, one of the things we talk a lot about is how do we better communicate our ideas. Any thoughts from either of you in terms of your experience out there? How have you talked about this where you've started to see some traction, or ways in which these groups, as they approach this, can talk about it in ways that start to move the needle back, or to create additional buy-in and momentum for you know, in some ways we want an inclusive economy, and instead of equity we want equality, and then of course the true diversity. So messaging, key phrases, what are you finding works, resonates, and is maybe crossing lines and bringing new people into where you're arguing from? Patrice, maybe from you first.
Sure, Lyall. I think I'll start with our public school system. And over the past 2 years, I think nothing has done a better job of bringing independent mothers and fathers into the understanding of the difference between between equality and equity than sitting next to their child during the pandemic and listening to what they're hearing on the screen, and hearing how critical race theory has now filtered down into, you know, their third graders' history lessons and plans, you know, about how to be a good anti-racist. It's also shown up in Sesame Street. I know for myself, because while I was working with my 2- and 3-year-old one day, I heard Elmo say, "I want to be an anti-racist too. How do I do that?" And I stopped in my tracks because I recognize now that these messages are creeping through. They've always been through the media, but really hitting our kids. And so I think there's already a ripe ground for this, and it's not ideological at all. Moms from the right, left, and center in particular. So now it's saying, start with where we agree. I said earlier, we should not be reflexively anti-diversity. What we should be is understanding diversity as more than just race and gender, and diversity of viewpoint, diversity of thought, diversity of background, of experience. You start there with your messaging. Yeah, we want to have organizations, companies that, you know, reflect our values, pursue our mission, people who believe in what we believe in, you know, from whatever background that they come from. It's not just getting certain types of people on just to pat ourselves on the back and say, "Oh, I'm not an anti-racist anymore." So I think the messaging has to be about, you know, we want diversity, but this is the kind of diversity that we're really looking for. And then, you know, when it also, I think there are words to avoid and some messages to avoid. And interestingly, at the Philanthropy Roundtable, we did an exhaustive, extensive methods research campaign, part of this campaign, to test what works and what doesn't. And I think one of the biggest takeaways for me is that as conservatives, sometimes because we know that ideologues have hijacked this conversation, that we want to turn away from it entirely and not recognize that we have common ground with most regular people who are not buying into the kneel and fist in hand, but also recognize, hey, I want a society that welcomes everyone. And so when you take that perspective and you start talking about, well, what do you mean by equity? What do you mean by equality? What are you trying to get at? Are you trying to help all the kids in this classroom or just some? How fair or unfair is that? Using words like fairness. Actually, fairness is a great word to be utilizing on a regular basis. When it comes to women, to the transgender issue, in separate hat from the round table, but in another hat of mine, we talk about transgender issues. It's a fairness issue. Then you start to use language like that appeals to people who are in the middle and reclaims, frankly, some of the power that the other side has taken to be able to push forward on their agendas. So I think think about diversity. Make sure you're saying when you're talking about diversity, it is broader than just your skin or your gender. And then number two, the fairness issue. Equity is unfair, patently unfair. And can I just say something in response to what Mike was saying about who's benefiting, even at the college level or the professional level? All groups are not the same. I'm black, yes, but I'm a black immigrant, and my experience is very different from a black person whose roots go back to slavery in this country. Equity is supposed to fix all of our problems. I don't have problems. I'm on a stage in front of all of you beautiful people. I'm not the one who needs to be helped. And also, there are people who are white who are in far worse conditions than some of my friends certainly have ever been in. Equity doesn't help them. So how is it moving the needle when we talk about outcomes for everybody when you're helping a privileged few at the expense of everyone else? You start to challenge those assumptions. You start to challenge what people think or try to get out of this whole DEI conversation. And suddenly, a lot of what they are doing, you recognize, you expose it for what it is. It's performative and it's destructive.
Mike?
I told you before that Patrice and I were going to finish each other's sentences. So I'm going to just take off from what she said. I don't know what plays well messaging. One of my phobias is to focus groups. I'm more like with Margaret Thatcher when they talked to her about public opinion. She responded, I make public opinion. I think it's important to get out, explain things, expose things, and try to change the climate of opinion. But I think one thing that would work is exactly what Patrice said, disaggregate the groups, right? I just looked at it this morning. I looked at household income in this country. Obviously, Indian Americans just blow everyone out of the water in household income. They have double the household income as white Americans. But you know who does better than white Americans? Ghanaian Americans and Nigerian Americans, higher household income than whites. West Indian Americans are just below white, but well above black Americans if you take a look at black Americans as a whole, right? So what does this say? Well, Patrice was just talking about, if you're a racist cop or a racist store owner, and a black person walks in there, they're going to act racist towards them. They're going to discriminate against them, to do all sorts of things that supposedly, if you believe in systemic racism, would hold that person down. And yet you find that that is not the case, that there are a group of Americans. In fact, Van Tran at Columbia University up the street has done studies on this. He's isolated second-generation West Indians whom he says they have 100% visibility as blacks, but because they no longer have an accent, they have zero visibility as immigrants. They do very well, as I just said, in household incomes. They outperform in many cultural indicators. What that means is if you start disaggregating the groups, rather than say African Americans, whites, Hispanics, if you disaggregate by national origin, if you disaggregate by family formation, you will start getting different numbers. Last night, I spoke in Toledo, Ohio, at an American Legion Hall. They still exist. There's a real America out there. and demographically, I had about 120 people there. If you don't know this part of the country, it's heavily unionized, industrial. And it's about the same demographic as you. But I bet they think very differently from you, even though they're demographically the same. The people that I spoke to in Sylvania, Ohio last night may look like you demographically, a phrase that I hate, but they're not like you. If you want to arrive at good outcomes, you wouldn't say, well, we just have to limit the number of whites. And no, you'd want a certain number of people from this room, and you'd want a certain number of people from that American Legion Hall that I had last night in there, because they would have a truly different perspective, and that would be true diversity.
Yeah, you've kind of hit on something, and I know something within the movement, kind of one of the core underlying principles is this collectivism versus individualism.
Right.
And it would seem to me, again, on the messaging, how do we talked even in the title, right? The valuing the individual and kind of the dignity of the individual and recognizing who they are would be one of those core messages that, the one. How do we talk to the one? How do we approach the one? One of the other areas that you talked about, Patrice, on this is kind of the lack of DEI to focus on outcomes. Is in terms of some of the testing that you did, does that play well in looking at, do people respond well to say, listen, the program doesn't work? anything there that might be effective? And also just from a resource standpoint, is that data available to share with others?
So that was internal message testing, but we will be having we will have resources as part of this campaign. We will be releasing a toolkit that's going to have some of this messaging, but also, how you can have these conversations, what they should look like in your organizations, if you have grantees, how you can have those conversations, and they're going to be tough ones. But I think we do kind of talk a lot about outcomes, because we recognize that, for 50 years now of welfare programming, we haven't moved the needle with certain communities. And so an outcomes-based approach is going back to the individual. What do you say to the black kid in Appalachia and the white kid in Appalachia and the black kid in Roxbury, Massachusetts? How are they doing? And have these welfare programs actually worked, or do we need a different way? Do we need something different? And then at organizations, frankly, a lot of organizations are already doing good work. And so a great way to attack this is to highlight those individuals who have risen over the obstacles, not just their systemic racism, but risen over growing up in a single parent household, risen over having physical ailments, diseases, and have turned their life into something else. And that's why I love to highlight nonprofit organizations that are doing this. The Woodson Center, I'll name. They're not giving me a check for saying this,
They're
but
wonderful.
I think that they're wonderful, and they have a network of people who are on the ground doing this. So, I think when we talk about outcomes, you have to give examples of individuals who haven't benefited from one approach, but who have benefited from another.
Yeah, Bob Woodson is a wonderful American. I would say, Patrice, that the Great Society has moved the needle, and sometimes in the wrong direction. Let's not forget Moynihan and Glazer, when they wrote their report, I believe it was 1968, about the out-of-wedlock birth rates in the black community, said this is unsustainable, this is a killer, we have to do something about this. It was at 27%. Today, it's inching up to 75%. Yeah. So is this the result of the Great Society? There are many good arguments that say there is. To go back to collective groups that Patrice brought up, critical race theory. One of the main elements of critical race theory is this idea of the collective groups and collective rights and collective ideas, and the fact that they have the same opinion. Angela Harris, one of the architects of critical race theory, writes about this, and she says, we're going to have to use myth making to create these groups, Hispanics, for example. But this idea that collective group is the locus of thinking of rights is something that we need to get away from very quickly. We're a country of individualists. We're a country where obviously the individual and his family and her family, right, and the community. I'm not against that at all. I'm very, very much for that. But if you're a religious person, you believe that salvation really comes individually, and if you believe in natural rights, it is the individual who has the natural rights, and then he should be allowed by government to act according to his family's best interest. To think to create a collective by government fiat and then say everybody in this collective group thinks the same, it's a really, really bad idea.
Well, and when we look at, what has groupthink delivered for people? I mean, we're looking back at some of the exit polling from last week, we've seen marginal increases or decreases in the black vote for the Democratic Party and Democratic candidates, right, and significant shifts for Hispanics.
And Asians. 17 percentage points for Asian Americans.
So this tells us that I think groups are starting to realize, individuals are starting to realize, being part of the groupthink is not getting me very far. Right. It's not delivering on any promises, and frankly, the promises being made are not being made to me. Promises to ensure that my neighborhood is safe, promises to ensure that my kid can go to an excellent school no matter what zip code I live in, promises to say, you know what, if you want to start a business, I'm not going to strangle you with red tape and regulations. They're recognizing that this groupthink is not delivering on that. It's delivering few benefits for a privileged few who have figured out how to monetize it really well. I just like to say these Marxists are the best capitalists today. Like BLM is a great example of that.
All right, we'll take maybe one question from the group, maybe two if we can get to it really, really quickly. So I see a hand raised right here. I don't know if we can get a microphone or just talk really, really loud.
Just shout.
Shout it out.
I'll just shout it out. So you talk about guilt as being part of the problem here. And I do not mean this at all I don't care about any major religion, but it seems to me if you're going to undercut the other side, one avenue is to point out the difference between carry guilt or blood guilt, which we try, many of, I think the more enlightened you, is to believe in forgiveness. And I'm just going to put that out for comment or answer from you as to how that idea of blood guilt versus forgiveness plays into the Marxist narrative that wants to anchor us in blood guilt, like the 1619 Project, versus what we're trying to hopefully bring forward.
By the way, Nicole Hannah-Jones, as I said, explicitly says that she's playing on guilt. Look, one of the problems with this whole ideology is, as you said, the absence of forgiveness and forgetting. And this is what we need as a society, as individuals. At the end of the day, if we don't forgive and forget, we're killing ourselves. We know that it stays with us. We're not doing anybody else anything bad. And this, what this says is that is the opposite of forgiving and forgetting. We must curate grievances. We must remember every grievance and then curate them and make them alive today. For example, Obama, when he spoke at I forget what group it was, about 5 years ago, his Hispanic group, he talked about how a prominent Mexican-American from Los Angeles had been humiliated by a cop. That happened in the 1930s. So this idea of coming back and Ed Roybal, we have to do the opposite. Not that we forget slavery, not that we forget Frederick Douglass, not that we forget Plessy versus Ferguson and Jim Crow and the lynchings. We have to know that history, but we also have, as a society, have to look at the present and the future.
I mean, I think there's a desire for a truth and reconciliation commission similar to what happened in South Africa once, and I think it was Nelson Mandela became president. I would like to believe that a nationwide forgiveness campaign is going to satisfy the corporate, not corporate, but the financial desires of a lot of these people. It will not. They actually need to hold something over the heads of individuals, of corporations, as a hammer and a threat. And so, yes, as people, as a woman of faith, yeah, I want to be able to forgive. I want others to be forgiven. But also, we have to recognize that, if something that happened 300 years ago, I shouldn't be paying for it in reparations. It just makes no sense. And I'm an immigrant from another country. I had no reparations from the British government when the British brought slaves, and some of them were Irish to the Caribbean to settle it and raise sugarcane. So I understand, and I think the key here is to recognize the past, to say, yeah, that was evil, that was wrong. We can absolutely call it wrong out for what's wrong, but say, now how are we moving forward? And let's not forget, blacks in this country were doing well post-Civil War. Reconstruction was an amazing time.
The Harlem Renaissance.
The Harlem Renaissance.
Yeah.
We can look at marriage rates, business rates.
Much better than white rates, by the way.
They were at that time.
Yeah.
So it's not to say that throughout history, all of blacks in this country have forever been in a struggle. They have not. And it wasn't because of the government that they were able to advance. It was because of the strength of the community, the strength of the family, and the strength of the individual.
All right. Well, thank you, Mike and Patrice, for a very interesting conversation. Looking forward to some of the tools from the toolkit. Again, I know from a funding standpoint, this is a critical thing for us, those of us who are fundraising, to be looking at, to understand. And again, if we have a more positive view, again, thank you, Patrice, for that. If we're not just no, but we have a better definition of inclusiveness and what an inclusive economy looks like, that equality is where we want to be, that there's a dignity in the individual, and it's that dignity of the individual, not the collective, that brings the value of diversity to light. I think we have a positive way forward. So thank you very much. Before we wrap up here, a couple of things and get to the Lyall lecture. A reminder of some of the concurrent sessions that will happen right after, to stick around. We've got some great things coming. An interview with Alex Gladstein, that will be in one of the ballrooms, the habits of successful partners. Looking forward to that conversation, some best practices, ways we can learn from our peers. And then an additional session, how to accelerate freedom with Nick Gillespie, that will be in the Gramercy room. Those will all happen after the Ligio lecture as you kind of plan your day and look for ways to engage in some great content coming up later on. So join me in giving a round of applause to Patrice and Mike.